Good evening, everybody. I am not Lindsay Harris, the Mellon Professor in charge of the School of Classical Studies. Lindsay is listening via the miracle of technology. Hi, Lindsay. She can't say anything, though. I'm standing in for Lindsay tonight. As all of you, I think, know, I'm Kim Bowes, the director of the Academy, and it's a real pleasure. I don't get to do this anymore, so it's a particular real pleasure to introduce Joe Williams, who is the Phyllis G. Gordon, Lily Auchinslaw, Samuel H. Kress Foundation Pre-Doctoral Rome Prize, year one of a 2-year fellowship in medieval studies. As many of you will know, Joe is a doctoral candidate at Duke University in the Art History Department, where he's specializing in medieval architecture in Italy and the Islamic West. He's also been working on a wonderful digital project, which is called the Kingdom of Sicily Database, which is collecting lots of information on the Kingdom of Sicily, or two Sicilies, as it was, and putting all that information online, which is a collaboration with the International University of Venice. Joe has been working assiduously away at his dissertation, which is very good, and that is what he's here to do. He's also giving a series of papers at scholarly conferences, including the Medieval Conference. Is this the one at Leeds? Kalamazoo.
I'm not sure if there's one at Leeds or Kalamazoo.
That Medieval Conference. Closer to home, the École Française. So as many of you will know, Joe's dissertation is on a single building, which is the Cathedral at Molfetta. And by looking at a single building, he's hoping to crack open a whole series of much bigger problems. Many of you saw this building with Joe. I did not have that privilege when all of you went off to Puglia on the fall trip. And as I understand it, Joe is an amazing guide taking you all through this building and talking about the way in which, in the very details of the construction of this structure, are revealed not only the hands of the people who built it, but it is, in a way, a kind of encyclopedia of the transfer of knowledge. So what Joe is interested in is the way in which aspects of the history of construction reveal aspects of the exchange of knowledge across the Mediterranean. The cathedrals of Puglia, as those of you who went to Puglia will know, represent an extraordinary knowledge network of Norman builders on the one hand from France and Byzantine builders from the other side of the Mediterranean on the other, and then lots of intermediate networks of which Puglia becomes its sort of own nexus in the middle. And I think one of the things that's most interesting about Joe's work is the way in which these small details, right, the way in which an arch is constructed, the way in which certain kinds of stones are cut to fit together, reveal that knowledge practice. So in many ways, for those of you who have been following this really interesting history of Mediterranean studies in recent years, so on the one hand, the corrupting sea, on the other hand, on the Bronze Age side, the making of the Middle Sea, David Avalafia, who's sort of been the great historian since Brodel of the Mediterranean, these are all huge sweeping histories of a sea. What Joe is doing is in many ways the opposite. He's using one building, right, constructed over a period of time, but a pretty tight chronology, to crack open the same issues, right? To understand the way in which that sea connected and didn't divide, and the way in which knowledge practices moved across an ocean in a way that in some ways undermine the idea of the monument, right? The monument is a single moment. The monument is a product of an individual design. This instead, as Joe would like us to see it, is a much more complicated process and is really about the intersection of cultures. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Joe Williams, evidence from 3D photography of the Church of St Corrado in Molfetta.
Thank you, Kim, for that very rich introduction and very thoughtful.
I should add that Lindsay wrote the introduction.
And thank you, Lindsay. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to share a part of my work with everyone here and to avail myself of your diverse perspectives, an opportunity that will become all the more vital as I come to incorporate multidisciplinary techniques into my base of art historical training, including tools and questions from archaeology, social history, and the digital humanities. I would like to open with a provocation in the form of two juxtaposed images of different physical phenomena. Depicted on the left is the old Cathedral of St Corrado in Molfetta, one of many large and impressive limestone churches built between the 12th and 13th centuries on the Adriatic littoral of Apulia in southern Italy. The plan of this cathedral betrays the fact that it did not enjoy a continuous construction history or conform to the unitary scheme of one patron or master mason. This is an infamous cathedral in the historiography for its misalignment of axes, for its discontinuities in ornament, for using different techniques to build the domes, any number of things. It's also a very intriguing building for the presence of techniques that not only come from the local orbit, but from, in fact, much farther afield. Take these interlaced arches that you see a couple times in Apulia, and that's it. But you also see clusters of this form coming about in the same time in southern Spain, Albania, Amalfi, Sicily. And as the documents show, this building was financed slowly and incrementally between the early to mid-1100s and the end of the 1200s through the sporadic wills of various elites, including the clergy of the church, as well as judges and laymen from the city of Molfetta and its environs. St. Corrado is in this way a product of a certain historical conjuncture. Its construction was made possible, and its visual character deeply affected, by the plurality of wealthy landowners competing for status in Molfetta, landowners whose revenues from agricultural interests, especially from the olive and its ever-popular oil, had simultaneously ballooned in response to the expanding Mediterranean trade connections of Apulian ports like Molfetta at this time. My dissertation considers the case example of this building and its relevant comparanda in order to probe the development of architectural industry in a region undergoing rapid transformation by the economic structures of Mediterranean trade. How did the increase in commerce, beyond simply providing the great sums demanded by large-scale church building, shape the mechanisms by which resources were extracted, by which information was communicated between the quarry and the construction site, and by which architectural knowledge and the human beings who bore it traveled between this building and others? To put it another way, I attempt to examine the architectural choices at St. Corrado in relation not only to the formal program of the single work of art, which Kim very eloquently described, but also to the opportunities and resources of the deeper structures of church building in the region. And this brings me to the analogy of the chestnut tree depicted in the bottom right of this screen. This chestnut has undergone grafting, the genetic melding of two different tree species, by planting a seedling with more desirable fruit on the trunk of a species with more desirable root stock. In a penetrating article, Pierre Toubert, the great historian of Latin Christendom, demonstrates that in 12th century southern Italy, the chestnut, among other crops, was subject to a host of savvy horticultural technologies developed in response to the growing importance of trade in the region. The arrival of pan-Mediterranean commerce to the coasts meant that chestnut farmers and owners of chestnut plots served a much larger and more competitive market. They met the challenge with energy and ingenuity, concatenating plots, creating homogeneous groves from choice fruiting trees, and critically by creating new hybrids through grafting. To appreciate the chestnut tree in the fullness of its relationship to human action, how and why particular practices came to be applied to it, by and for whom the unique flavor of its fruit was created, requires looking beyond the single example and considering how ideas like grafting served a larger strategy or at least responded to a larger set of economic demands and conditions. I take the same tack in relation to the Church of St Corrado in Molfetta, considering the extent to which its diverse and inventive artistic solutions were enabled and guided by the structures of interdependence among a large number of buildings. Today I shall share a part of my project that is very much in progress, my execution and analysis of photogrammetry, the capture of the structural properties of an object or space in 3 dimensions by combining the data of multiple photographs. First, I will discuss how the field of Apulian architectural history, and more broadly Mediterranean art history, stands to benefit from these photogrammetric interventions. Then I will reflect on particular qualities of the technology, its affordances, its limitations, and distortions, in order to justify and outline my own use of it towards specific questions in my dissertation. Thirdly, I will showcase my photogrammetric method in action by discussing a particular architectural problem at San Corrado, and I will close by considering some early implications of my findings, which are at present no more than tentative hypotheses, to continue testing by collecting and analyzing more data. As a student of medieval architecture in Apulia, I am blessed to study a body of material on which long traditions of art history, archaeology, restoration, conservation, and social history have all converged with thorough and insightful interventions. In the realm of art history, the study of Apulia's monuments has benefited from a long tradition of formal comparison and classification. This is the legacy of magisterial surveys by Heinrich Schultz, shown here in the mid-19th century, and Emile Berthaud in the early 1900s. This comparative methodology has become more and more granular and precise, creating smaller and smaller classification systems into the 20th century, and this is indeed a very rich base of information to work from. The most recent research on the Church of San Corrado, including significant sections dedicated to this church in books by Pina Belli Delia and Kai Kappel, embodies a larger trend in Apulian architectural history, which is to look beyond the old classification systems and narratives of a kind of formal evolution, but to enrich this information with archival research into other dimensions of history, such as the cult of saints, turf wars among different ecclesiastical and political institutions. We have the Normans, as Kim mentioned, the Byzantine Empire. We also have many different orders of the Catholic Church competing for land, Benedictine monasteries, military orders, crusading groups. It really is a cacophonous kind of social situation. Belli Delia, Kappel, and their contemporaries, furthermore, bring a certain sensitivity to the capacity of individual monuments for institutional change, which connects these buildings to a more international sphere of social and political phenomena. In this way, architectural historians of Apulia have found ways to engage the problem of the region's architectural openness, and I think in this way their work compares to the work of people like Jill Caskey and Mediterranean art historians working today, Heather Grossman, Gulru Netapoglu. And they found ways to, they found ways to engage the problem of the region's architectural openness in opposition to the closed systems of earlier formal typologies, while at the same time compellingly addressing the problem from the angle of institutional networks and travel paths, factors which made patrons aware and appreciative of a more cosmopolitan world of visual ideas and tastes. But there remains to my mind, Much to be done yet in explaining the logistics of how architectural ideas traveled, a theme which has been usefully framed by Heather Grossman in her work on memory regimes that allowed medieval builders to transpose architectural techniques across long distances. The information we have for the travel of builders in Puglia is tantalizing. A handful of sculptors and architects are known to have contracted between cities and across the Adriatic. But these documents form a small base on which to address the problem of the great diversity of forms and techniques found in the architecture of the region, not to mention how these ideas were absorbed or transformed by local workshops. My dissertation considers this question by pairing the evidence of buildings with that of documents, calling upon the methods and findings of architectural archaeologists, as well as those of social historians. Both fields have planted firm roots in Apulian soil. Construction archaeologists at the Politecnico di Bari, Angelo Ambrosi, Rosella de Cadillac, Enrica de Leonardis, have championed the creative and artistic value of architectural techniques, contesting its oft-assumed supporting role technique vis-a-vis the overall visual and spatial impression of the finished building. In this effort, they have identified a great variety of intricate stone shaping, stone carving, assembly, and geometric proportional techniques that circulated widely among the Apulian lodges. And this is a kind of archaeological technique, a technique that would go under the heading of archéologie du bâti, or construction archaeology, where you define layers in the vertical plane of a wall, temporal layers and layers of damage and destruction, restoration, so on. Meanwhile, historians, social historians, such as Pierre Toubert and Jean-Marie Martin, and scholars based at the École Française de Rome, have considered Apulian architecture from an economic point of view as an enterprise that involved the opening of quarries, transportation of stone, acquisition of labor, and dedication of funds out of the revenues and treasuries of bishops and abbots, all subjects richly documented in the papers of the École Française. But finally, I've turned to those studying medieval architectural production in France, especially Dieter Kippel and more recently Vibeke Olsen, whose work seems to connect the dots between the architectural archaeologist's granular study of construction technique and practice and the economic questions of the social historian. By finding patterns in the dimensions of masonry or in the sequence of assembly, either at a single building or in comparison to many buildings, Kimpel and Olsen have been able to reveal standardized or changing conventions, and by implication, signs of the behavior of the larger building industry in a particular place at a particular time. It is in pursuit of the same kind of understanding that I have learned and applied the tools of construction archaeology, measuring stones, sketching ornamental details and structural components, cataloging variations in technique throughout the church, but most recently the digital tool known as photogrammetry. In late October this year, I traveled to Molfetta, not for the first time, but with new eyes and a completely new agenda. I was to conduct a campaign of photogrammetry, a modeling technology that produces a 3D point cloud from multiple photographs taken at different positions and angles vis-a-vis the object photographed. I was trained in photogrammetry through a series of labs at the Wired Lab for Digital Art History and Visual Culture at Duke University. Although I collected photogrammetric data for all parts of St. Corrado's interior and exterior, what you see here is only the interior of the east end of the church, or rather, you see a somewhat imperfectly processed model thereof. I emphasize that the goal of this first attempt was to explore the affordances of the technology and find leads for future, more rigorous modeling campaigns, if indeed it turns out to be a fruitful research path. Classified as a structure from motion technology, photogrammetry uses as its source the itinerant camera. Stop. Uses as its source the itinerant camera, recreating surfaces by matching the image data of multiple snapshots. And here are the snapshots marked in blue that I've taken of the east end. In this way, photogrammetry is akin to the way a human being explores and judges the contours of a space through motion and through a complex triangulation of visual stimuli. The software, and I use Photoscan, uses a series of algorithms to bridge the gap between the photos and the model. It begins by generating a cloud of sparsely distributed points that in this case number in the mere hundreds of thousands. Next, the cloud is enriched. Yes. Oh my goodness. The cloud is enriched by tens of millions of interpolated points to make what is called a dense point cloud. The points become the angles of small facets upon which the colors of the images are overlaid to construct a texture. Here are the facets, little triangles, and then the images overlaid upon them. The structure from motion method is in opposition to approaches that work directly with physical contours of objects, such as laser scanning or taking molds. This difference means that photogrammetric models constantly threaten to distort complex surfaces into flat ones. Contours can only be reconstructed to the degree that the camera can move in and around them. The user of the photogrammetric model has constantly to be aware of this capacity for distortion, as the planar images that pose for the more complex surfaces can be rather illusionistic. These small distortions are part of a more serious one. The matrix of surfaces that make up the 3D model have no substance behind them. Indeed, the model is a reduction of a three-dimensional object to many folded up two-dimensional planes. The photogrammetric model, seen simply as a matrix of surfaces, echoing and measuring the walls of the building and relations between them, and not as some sort of replica that attempts to approximate primary experience of the space, offers much to the researcher. I have thus far used photogrammetry primarily to illuminate questions of chronology, which is the focus of the first chapter of my dissertation. My chronological method borrows from construction archaeology. It begins by attempting a relative chronology, or a chronology of sequences, first by identifying masonry breaks, then analyzing variations in fabric, or units of reference, in order to attribute those variations to different concurrent phases, or stratigraphic units. It proceeds on to clues for absolute chronology, or to put it less absolutely, chronology coordinated with dated event or date ranges, for which documents are a key reference. And photogrammetry really helps me the most with relative chronology, just looking at the fabric and trying to figure out what came before what. My use of photogrammetric technology contributes mostly to the sequential analysis of a small measurement like this. And I've done my best to check these measurements by taking my own on site when the distances and corners are accessible. In addition, undistorted two-dimensional views, or orthophotographs, have facilitated the accurate visual analysis of dimensions, proportions, structural systems, and other properties of the wall surface. It is important to note that the ability to take orthographic views of parts of the building is a major shift from the primary experience of the edifice. It is incredibly misleading as a representation of the product presented to those who visit the space. but it is helpful in revealing the physical challenges and solutions pertaining to the builder's construction process. In this way, this tool has advanced my understanding of the chronology of San Corrado, not only in the narrow sense of helping me to put different phases in order, but also by divulging surprises about conventions of the ordering of the work, about the response of the various building teams to the givens of the earlier fabric, and about the extent of standardization of stones at various stages of their extraction and carving. For a small example of the method in action, I will demonstrate how my photogrammetric model helped to investigate the vexed problem of Molfetta's crypt. If and to what extent a crypt was completed, what form it took, and at what point in the sequence of the building's construction the crypt was suppressed. Prior to the employment of photogrammetric analysis, I had gleaned from my own observations and from considering the arguments of previous scholars a tantalizing but incomplete picture of the construction of the lower walls of the east end of the church. As many have noted, a series of arch traces and even fragmentary springers of groin vaults. I'll show you. Here are the arch traces in different corners of the building. And we also have the very fragmentary vault springers. And these traces strongly suggest the intent to build a crypt, and probably also the completion of a crypt before it was ultimately destroyed at an unknown point in time. Now, if we zero in on the northwest corner of the north wall, we're going to be looking at this corner here and this respond. Two masonry breaks seem to define three phases related to the crypt. And here I'm showing the first break, which has escaped mention by scholars until relatively recently, is visible in the northwest corner of the transept. The lower part of the north wall, with its 2+ crypt arches, you see that kind of is interrupted by the wall. It disappears behind this western respawn, resulting in a misalignment of the horizontal joints in the corner. The existence of a small part of a third arch on the north wall indicates an early phase in which a crypt more than 2 bays deep was at least planned and probably completed, given the survival of the fragmentary groin vault springers that we just saw. The construction that produced the first masonry break, that belonging to what I'm going to call phase 2, conflicted with many elements of phase 1. First, the new west wall appears to have acted as a new western terminus for the crypt, as it contained a wall arch trace of its own. Can't see it very well there, but it's this. We are missing the faces of the arch stones for this arch trace. Instead, what seems to have happened is that there was at some point in time, a smoothing of this wall surface, and the arch stones used to actually project. And so when they smoothed the surface, they cut right through an arch-shaped projection. You see the same thing here, except that the wall arch stones are still in place. They have not been cleaved through. So this new wall seems to have imposed a new western terminus for the east end of the church. And that would have shortened the crypt to only 2 complete bays. Now I've also identified a second break that seemed to announce a more extreme change in plan. The break includes a juncture where the arch trace on the west face of the new wall is curtailed to make way for horizontal coursing that seems to stack around and above the arches while also invading their space to create flat surfaces at the corners. See that? And it cuts off what might be a barrel vault, might have been a barrel vault. And we've exposed the rubble core of what might have been a continuous wall that went across this space here. In addition, the joints of this coursing match those of the lower parts of the wall in the central bay, down here, which fixes the base of this wall at the present day floor level. In addition, on the south face of this dividing wall, an ashlar-faced lower border articulates a stair pattern to which today's stairs correspond. It's not that easy to see. It goes like that. While the second phase appears to have shortened the crypt, this third phase appears to have done away with it altogether, flattening the wall and suppressing or lowering the level of the floor. Merely looking for masonry breaks and considering the circumstantial evidence has only gotten me so far. My scaled photogrammetric model allowed me to measure and compare stones in places that were not ordinarily accessible, as well as to compare more specialized parts such as bases, shafts, capitals, or imposts, which becomes especially useful in recognizing layers from different parts of the church, stratigraphic layers, allowing me to attribute more substantial parts of the construction to this skeleton provided by breaks. Now, unfortunately, my analysis of regular rectangular blocks, which I did on-site and with the photogrammetry, was rather inconclusive despite the good accuracy of the data. The widths and heights of the courses varied significantly, even within continuous wall sections between masonry breaks, and differences on either side of the breaks were not significant enough to say definitively whether or not they were carried out from the same supply of stones. More fruitful was the analysis of specialized parts of the 12 arch supports. Their names are 2RN, 3RN, 3RS. I've become very familiar with my supports here. We have the 4 supports engaged to the walls or respawns. That's 2RN, 3RN, 3RS, and 2RS. And we also have 8 other members, 4 for each of the piers, 2PN and 2PS. I considered the different specific ways that each support varied. For example, the diameter of their shafts, or the tools used in carving their capitals. For each such category, I identified units of reference, or specific variations. For example, if we're talking about shaft diameter, I would have a size class of 70 to 72 centimeters. For capitals, a capital carved using a drill. When identifying variations in dimensions, I really grouped together elements that measured within a few centimeters of each other, allowing for slight error on the part of the photogrammetric point cloud, in order to distinguish between near exact matches that could possibly imply contemporary production and less exact matches that might signal an attempt to fit new construction to the old. And I really have to interject that I enjoy the properties of the piers. Their massiveness really contributes to the kind of primary experience of the space. So I've color-coded just to help us out different the different size classes of the different kinds of variations. So here we're going to look at the pier width size classes. And starting from the foundation piers, which is what we're looking at now, these are the supports that rest below the actual columns. Starting from the foundation piers, we have something resembling a relatively orderly palimpsest. If the closely matching pier widths do outline different periods of construction, it might make sense of our earlier analysis of masonry breaks. If the widths of 2RN and 2RS were constituted at the same time, not necessarily through the completion of the pier, but possibly by construction of the crypt wall, this development would be consistent with the goals of phase 2 of the masonry breaks, wherein the crypt was shortened and a new west wall constituted. On the other hand, we cannot assume the completion of this pier until the construction of the support sets, base, shaft, and capital. And this moves us into much murkier waters. In opposition to the orderly palimpsest that we got with the foundation piers, the distribution of pier widths, the distribution of the bases and the shafts of different dimensions are mixed and matched among the different supports. This introduces the complicating, though also very interesting, factor of reuse of suppressed elements by later phases. This phenomenon seems especially evident in the asymmetrical distribution of bases and shafts throughout the east end, as well as the shafts' inconsistent pairing with bases, which is very odd. The heights of the capitals, on the other hand, the heights of the capitals bring us to somewhat more solid ground. Capitals need, for the most part, to match those adjacent to them in terms of height. It was not desirable for these conspicuous visual elements to be misaligned. Hence, the matching heights of the capitals clues us into the chronology of the finalization of these piers. It might be possible to identify some supports with the phase succeeding the crucial masonry break that ended phase 2, the break that suppressed the crypt and lowered the floor level of the east end to its current state. The strict accord between the capital heights of these three respawns, 2RN, 3RN, 3RS, as well as the supports of the east, south, and west sides of pier 2PN, may suggest a completion of these components together, even if some of the supports were assembled from shafts and new shafts and bases and some from hand-me-downs. If we remember that the support on 2RN comes after the masonry break that involved the revision of its supporting pier with inserted ashlar breaks and new masonry, that was break 2, we might infer that this pier and its partners on the east wall formed an ensemble under phase 3 and after the crypt had been suppressed. By extension, the dome which sits on these supports could not have been completed before this phase, as 3 of its supporting arches required the existence of these 2 respawns. In essence, it all gets very, very complicated, but the only way to keep track of it is with a good data system. And this brings me to some small tentative hypotheses. The 2 hypothetical phases that we've been able to outline by pairing the masonry breaks with the photogrammetric measurements seem to put the Church of St Corrado in comparison with 2 different common architectural schemes seen in other churches in close proximity to Molfetta. The construction corresponding to phase 1 and phase 2, the construction of this crypt of more than 2 bays, and then the imposition of a new western terminus for that crypt seems to compare to Giovinazzo Cathedral, Bisceglie Cathedral, and Santa Maria delle Porta, and Paolo del Colle, all churches very close by. Now, and we're looking at Giovinazzo. Now, the shortening of the crypt at Molfetta might still be understood in relation to this scheme if we allow for a kind of practical adjustment where the Cathedral of Molfetta was hemmed in the west by the closeness of the water. So the nave could only be so long if you went with a full 3-bay crypt. So we have to imagine that those practical concerns also come into play. But as I hypothesized with phase 3 or after, when the crypt was suppressed and domes were being built and the side aisles were being brought into a new relationship with the nave, and we had a new unified floor level, this all points to a kind of scheme of 3 domes on axis that we get with many churches in Apulia and somewhat contemporaneously with San Francesco and Trani, seen here. Was a Benedictine church before it was a Franciscan church. So I think what we have at San Corrado is not one dominant typology of building, either a 3-dome church or a basilica with a transept and a crypt. And I don't think it's necessarily a creative hybrid type where someone had the idea to combine those plans from the outset. Rather, I think it was constructed according to 2 different modules, one folded onto the other. Each module responded to a current charge, a set of critical expectations to be met coming from the bishop or the patron. But in addition to this charge was what Michael Baxendall calls the brief. Conditions such as the available resources and materials, and including in this case elements left behind by the earlier construction. Some elements might have been useful to keep in place, others to discard or opportunistically reuse. In other words, the more recent charge prevailed over the original plan. The latter was used as a source rather than as a guide. In this way, the idea of the module opposes the traditional framework of typologies of whole buildings. A building with an unusual overall form need not be rationalized according to an entire formal concept, but rather as a series of more standardized parts imposed at different times and responding to new charges. My second tentative observation is the presence of a certain pattern that suggests something of the division of labor between building and quarry, and that is a high degree of roughing out small elements and parts of larger ones, moldings and capitals, according to flexible templates. Here are 2 capitals right next to each other. And you see they're trying to respond to shafts that have different diameters. And so the capital on the left narrows itself. You even see it in the backing of the capital. It narrows itself down to that smaller diameter. This flexibility in the roughing out of the stones needed to be put in place suggests a kind of roughing out phase that's inextricable from on-site production, in addition to the roughing out that would have occurred at the quarry in order to reduce the size of the load on the cart. Now, the problem of matching different parts from different phases was quite common in Puglia, not only because so many churches were built in an incremental fashion, but also because many of them used spolia, reused elements from Roman or Byzantine buildings. And there was a need to create architectural apparati, small transitional elements for re-erecting the old pieces, often different one to the next. It required this small-scale roughing out. With the widespread development of this key stage of production, a fashion could be created for reusing pieces, a fashion in which other patrons might partake, an architectural Kate Middleton effect, as it were. Even in cases where ancient marble material was not available, but whose impressive monolithic appearance could be approximated in the large sections of limestone shafts seen here at Molfetto. To conclude, my recent forays into photogrammetry have allowed me more insight than before into the choices made at the level of manufacture, the response to the patron's charge rather than the charge itself. The choices made are often surprising. They responded to the challenges of diverse tastes, not with rigid rules, but with a set of strategies to achieve that diversity, while at the same time standardizing and streamlining when possible. This would have required on the part of each builder a corpus of improvisational schemes, in other words, a habitus. I hope to understand this habitus better, and above all to see how it was shaped not only by the challenges of a single building, but by those presented by a large group of great limestone churches that came to characterize Apulia and accompany this region in its economic ascendancy to the larger Mediterranean stage. Thank you.
I assume you will take some questions?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I never did understand what you thought about that crypt. And if I can preface it with, what did everyone else think about the crypt before you came along? So what's the
Sure.
historiography? Where did everyone land on yes crypt, no crypt, suppressed crypt, whatever? And then what's your
Sure.
contribution?
Yeah, there are multiple theories, and the first theory was that the church was built 2 bays deep, and that was the original plan of the edifice, and that this crypt was actually part of the entire church scheme, that this crypt was elevated and was consistent with the entire plan. Then another theory has come along that the crypt was never finished in the first place because it's absolutely impossible to justify with churches like Molfetta and its environs, the stone is often coming from the environs of Trani, and they can tell that by analysis of um, the actual composition of the stone. And in fact, when you look at Apulia, it has limestone deposits from the Cretaceous period. But some of the deposits, because of a kind of intersection of conditions throughout all that time, some of the deposits are better than others for the properties of construction. So actually what I think is really interesting is that in Lecce, you have pietra di Lecce. You have this warm limestone used for buildings in that region. And here near Trani, they're using pietra di Trani. They're finding the best places and shipping the quarries. They're not just going to the backyard. I think you can say that based on what little has been is known about the quarries. A lot of research has been done on the quarries by these scholars at the Politecnico in Bari, for example, and it's really fascinating. Yeah.
As an architect, my point of view would be, if you look at the base, it's connected to the roof, right?
Mm-hmm.
All the forces go down. I feel like the map you show, I really wanted to see more information about the top of the building. Yeah. Do you think you could help, solve maybe issues that are down there to understand what they wanted from the roof?
Thank you. I agree. It's what I was showing was actually this thing is actually a section, a horizontal section that I made using my model, but in fact, I would have to agree or admit that if we go back to the traditional plan, it contains more information. It contains the information of the roof, as you said, and it contains information at different sections of the elevation. So a floor plan like this actually contains a lot of information as a graphic that I think photogrammetry, you would struggle to do with photogrammetry. You have to kind of pick and choose sections rather than present more of a cohesive graphic.
I just want to support that, because I was actually asking the same question. You kept talking about the vaults, and I'm like, what vaults? Right?
Yeah.
And what do they look like?
Yeah.
Are they regular circular domes? Do they have pendances? Do they have squinches? Right?
Yeah.
I think when you talk about it in that way, it's critical, as Raheli says, to actually be talking about the superstructure and illustrate the superstructure. Because what you have now is you have all that data. You can build reconstruction models.
Mm.
Right? So that's
Yeah.
sorry, food. You were gonna say.
It's kind of a related technical question. So the photogrammetry model, is it like a 3D model? You can rotate around?
Yeah, you can mess with it. But it's, I had a kind of section of this paper dedicated to the play with models. And it was really lackluster because the play is kind of unfortunately hampered by things like processing speed, processing power. If anything, one thing I've learned is that you can get more into that manipulation of models by traversing between digital and analog. You know, printing the thing out, then drawing on it and using your own compass on your drafting table, or that we also have the capacity now for things like 3D printing. What if you 3D printed in a material that then you could cut up and mess with or put together like Legos? So I'm curious about going that direction, but I have to admit I didn't have enough of a fruitful experience doing it in these past couple months, other than simply trying to process all that data. Yeah.
Maybe related. I was wondering, so the theory about the crypts, you argued very convincingly to us on site at Molfetta, as I recall. It was amazing to see. But that was before your
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering to what degree, and it may just be my lack of understanding of technology, is photogrammetry useful as principally as a kind of research tool in that it allows you to measure things that you can't get to otherwise, principally as a kind of storage tool, and then it allows you to have a model of Molfetta that you can play with and not have to live in Molfetta all the time, lovely as that would be. Or is it principally useful as a data visualization tool, and being able to, whether digitally or via kind of analog or material outputs, present the
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that being on site is a great opportunity to see the building in a way you can't see it when you're not there, even if you've taken as many photographs as possible. And that's still true, I think, with photogrammetry. It's not the real thing. It's not like going on site. But I think it has some advantages in that it allows you views. I'm going to go back to an orthographic view. If we look at these two capitals, which are right across from each other, we're looking at them both in profile. They're out of alignment from each other, and I had no idea they were out of alignment, the tops of the capitals there, the imposts. I never, and I've looked at them forever on site, but I didn't see that. And you also see relationships between dimensions. You can really look using the kind of two-dimensional projection without distortion that a point cloud enables. If you take your own photograph, even far away, there's a kind of distortion. So actually, that's been the most powerful way in which this photogrammetric technology has helped me look at it. Actually, not to experience a 3D space, but to experience two-dimensional views that I didn't have access to.
My question is somewhat similar insofar as I very much understand that photogrammetry allowed you to essentially present a new understanding of the different phases of construction in this church,
Mm-hmm.
and allows for many sort of macro understandings of the church. I'm curious how photogrammetry is useful for understanding details.
Mm-hmm.
Is it something that's useful for understanding architectural ornament? Is it something that historians of sculpture would similarly find useful? When you talked about your two hypotheses at the end, I was curious whether photogrammetry is useful to you in thinking about the different types of working relationships between carvers on site and individuals in the quarry.
Mm-hmm.
Can you get a sense of facture or tool marks using photogrammetry? Or is it not precise enough to really tell you how things are made?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's definitely useful for looking at small details, even though what I've shown was a kind of larger space trying to make sense of this crypt. And a lot of people use it for a small object, and they take a very detailed model of it. And I have to tell you that I'm interested in doing that. I'm interested in doing it at Molfetta, but I haven't done it yet. One limitation, though, that would jump out to me right away is that you can't really use it to study tool marks except in a two-dimensional way, because there's no way you could get a photogrammetric model to take the contours of that surface at that level of detail, but a laser scanner can. So laser scanning is the alternative. And that's a big difference between the photogrammetry and the laser scanning. Yeah, I think that was it.
No other questions? Joe, thank you so much. I hope we're all gonna take you upstairs and buy him a drink and pepper him with further questions. I have many other questions, but in the meantime, thank you so much.
Thank you.
job better than most people